minimize this.
Yep.
Test. Good.
And those are just the seniors. I have to roll by approval for only. Are we all set?
The recording's on. I'm mic'd.
Oh, okay. You know, I wanted to wait maybe 2 more minutes.
It's fine. I just turned it on so we don't forget. There's Charles.
Okay. Yeah, I'm expecting Charles is coming. Jenny should be here. So we had a room change. I'm worried that people might not have
Ooh.
that email.
So I'm not going to say anything because I'm mic'd. Okay. Do you need this? You don't need this, do you?
All right. Okay. I'll say it again for posterity. Thank you all very much for coming. I'm delighted to see so many people here. And I'm especially pleased to welcome our guest, Professor Patsy Duff from University of British Columbia. Professor Duff received her master's degree from the University of Hawaii, which is my home state, and then her PhD from UCLA, which is just a little ways down the road south of here. She actually was a colleague of Dr. Frodison's, so I guess it's kind of like returning home for you. She is currently professor and distinguished university scholar in the Department of Language and Literacy Education at the University of British Columbia. She also co-directs the Center for Research in Chinese Language and Literacy Education. So I'm pleased to see so many Chinese teachers and ESL or EFL teachers in China here today. Patsy has written a number of books. I'm not going to tell you about all of them, but I'll tell you about a few of the most recent ones. In 2008, she published a book, Case Study Research in Applied Linguistics. In 2006, Inference and Generalizability in Applied Linguistics. In 2008, also, Language Socialization, which is a topic that she's going to talk about today. This was volume 8 of the Encyclopedia of Language and Education. And she has several other books in press or in progress. One of them is called, I think this Learning Chinese book is already published in press. Learning Chinese, Linguistic, Sociocultural, and Narrative Perspectives in press. And 2 other books that she's working on, Ethnographic Research in Applied Linguistics and Language Socialization. She's taught in many, many areas of the world. Korea, Japan, Canada, the United States. Those were the ESL teaching days, I guess. And then she's taught applied linguistics in many other countries. China, most recently, I guess, Taiwan, Central Europe, all over North America. She also has taught in Egypt, American University in Cairo, Hungary, and that's part of today's talk. And one last thing before I let her speak. She received the University of British Columbia Killam Faculty Teaching Prize in 2007. So we know that she's, as well as being a premier applied linguistics researcher, must be a terrific teacher. So without further ado, let's welcome Patricia Duff.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for that warm welcome and generous introduction, Dorothy. It's one of the great things about being in a profession like this is you get to visit wonderful universities, see old friends, meet new ones, or at least meet the person you've been emailing with back and forth for a while. I certainly have heard Dorothy speak, and I know her by reputation, but we've never had lunch till today. But it's really great to be here and to see Jan and Jin-Suk and others. And you'll see that I'm going to talk about some work I've been doing in both China and Hungary. More of the examples will come from China because I've been spending more time there, and I'm just working on the Hungary side of things now. And you'll see that on most maps it would look like they're on other sides of the actual map, but here you see that they're actually closer together than Vancouver is from say, China. And so, anyway, I'm going to talk about the work, and I'd like to thank the group that's hosted me here. Thank all of you for coming on Election Day. Hope you've had a chance to vote. I hope it wasn't see Patsy or vote, because as you know, it's a very tight contest. So don't miss the opportunity. And great to be back in California, where I graduated, as Dorothy said, 20 years ago, following in Jan's footsteps. She was ahead of me. I was there for her PhD defense. And anyway, some other acknowledgments. This work is funded by a Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, standard research grant, with my co-investigator, Dr. Duan Li. If some of you are in the Chinese teaching world, that's the world she also inhabits, in addition to language socialization. She was the director of the Chinese language program at UBC. And then some of our assistants on this project. Just to get to know you all, how many of you are graduate students? How many of you are faculty or instructors? Yes, so a mix. Okay, thanks. And how many of you are visiting scholars? That side. Okay, great. Welcome. So the plan is I will first give you a bit of an overview of the area of language socialization, which a number of other people here are involved in, Amy, for one, and Jin-Suk Lee, and perhaps others. I'll talk about some of my previous language socialization research contexts, in case you don't know that work, and why would you if you're not in the area. Rationale for the current study, and then some of the themes I'll be discussing, and then some emerging issues and next steps, and then I'll conclude, and there will be plenty of time for questions and discussion. So, what is language socialization? This is an approach to language learning and development that Jenny Cook-Gumpertz was very key in launching decades ago, and is still a wonderful authority in that area. But it draws on sociocultural theory out of cultural psychology, sociolinguistics, anthropology, applied linguistics, and education to look at language use and development in all kinds of communities. And Dorothy mentioned earlier a volume I put together, and a more recent one she didn't mention, and this is by Durante, Oakes, and Shefflin, 2012, which is a very comprehensive look at state of the art in language socialization across many different types of contexts. So what does language socialization look at? It looks at language learning as a kind of explicit and implicit socialization by others. And by that, I mean linguistic and social interaction, instruction, modeling, observation and experience with language, and through other affordances. And affordances in this case means things like media, textbooks, and that sort of thing. So it's socialization through these kinds of experiences into relevant communicative practices, that is, ways of using language or ways of using other semiotic systems, meaning-making systems, and into membership in particular cultures or communities and the values, ideologies, identities, and behaviors associated with those communities. So a way of showing it is that you have a learner here. It could be a baby. It could be someone a bit older who is engaging with others, sort of experts, older siblings, teachers, parents, caregivers. And through these kinds of interactions, the child gains access to this target culture, one's own home culture, school culture, community cultures. And in this way, language is mediating this access to knowledge and membership. Language is both a means and outcome of socialization, according to Shefflin and Oakes. And it's through this kind of interaction that I just showed you that newcomers, children usually in this early work, appropriate members' attitudes, worldviews, dispositions, practices, and so on, and become full-fledged members, become proficient in the ways of that community or culture. So it draws on a kind of apprenticeship metaphor. The early work tended to be looking at little children in their own communities, and therefore it was more or less assumed that the process and outcomes would be monolingual in many of the contexts in which the research was situated in the 80s, for example, that it would be, that it was inevitable that people would get to that end state, proficiency, membership, that it was more or less linear. There's a bidirectional aspect, but that the people at the, on the receiving end, on the mentoring side of it, would be fully accepting of the new person's membership and expecting it, and that it would also be desired by the newcomer and by the old-timers, facilitated and accommodated. And a lot of the work I've been doing for the last 15 years has been examining some of those assumptions, especially in the new context in which many of us work with multilingual, transnational, other kinds of populations. But the basic principle is that it's through these interactions that people gain expertise. So in SLA, second language acquisition, and in language socialization studies as one area related to that, there's interesting work going on with different populations and with the different kinds of foci. And why is that? Because there's more study abroad going on. There's more research on foreign language learners, on short-term sojourners or migrants, refugees, older learners, like much older, heritage language learners, thinking of Jinsuk's work, generation 1.5 learners, and all the way down, transnationals and so on, to very young learners, peer learners, peer-to-peer learning, and also socialization across disciplines. And across different genres or ways of representing knowledge. I'm thinking of the writing people here. So it really goes across the lifespan, across different kinds of communities, and involving different language combinations. And the work people have been doing in recent times has focused more on these kinds of things. What are the ideologies that these newcomers or these members of communities are encountering, rejecting, embracing, being kind of mentored into? What kinds of identities? What kinds of communities or networks? What are their trajectories of learning and participation? What kinds of agency do they display or can they display? What kinds of resistance and so on? So these are some of the themes that come up in much of this work. So we've gone beyond some of the early, more or less monolingual contexts to more bilingual, bicultural, bimodal socialization, multilingual, multicultural, looking at indigenous communities and their languages. What does it mean to be socialized into a language that the elders themselves don't know anymore because of language attrition or obsolescence and that sort of thing. And other kinds of post-colonial contexts raise interesting issues around expertise and authority, and then work with multiple kinds of, not just first and second language, but it might be a third or fourth language or a heritage language, or as I'll be talking about today, more in the foreign language domain or in lingua franca contexts. So when you have these different combinations of languages, you might have someone learning their first language, say Chinese, and then they learn English, and then they learn Spanish, and then they go back and learn Chinese because they've already forgotten it by the time they get to university. Very common, right, for immigrant or second, third generation kids in America or Canada. That's a very common scenario. But it's, so the people are learning languages possibly in different sequences, so that becomes interesting to research. They're learning to different levels. It's not that they all get there to the end point. And it might be because they don't need to, they don't want to, they don't have enough opportunity. They may be learning different languages or using different languages, being socialized into and through different languages at the same time or at different times in sequence. There might be interruptions, might be wholesale shift over to another language, never to return to the former ones. And then there might be in different kinds of role relationships where it's the kids who are socializing the parents into the ways of the community. They're language brokers or cultural brokers, and they have a better sense of the community than their parents who may just be less familiar with the local norms and conventions. Return migration and transnationalism poses many interesting possibilities, and then all these other sorts of things. And then looking at issues of not just going from one language to another or having two separate languages and communities, but then seeing how people blend them and use them in code switching and other kinds of hybrid or multimodal practices. Here's a recent example, not from my work, but from a PhD I examined in Finland a couple months ago by Alicia Kopp-Jinkerson. Her surname is now Myrkkynen, I think it is. Her Finnish surname is now different. But anyway, we think of Finland as quite homogeneous, small population, mostly Finns. But it's changing for the same reasons it's changing in other places. And in her research, she was looking at kids in English immersion programs in Finland designed for Finnish children, but also for expat families working for Nokia or working for other companies who are coming and going from Finland, or for returnees, Finns who had worked in China, the parents, and had come back to Finland, and they wanted their kids to continue English medium education. So in this study, she was looking at how children were being socialized by a teacher into a monolingual English norm, like only use English in this classroom because other kids won't understand otherwise. And then where the kids themselves started policing one another, peer socializing, tattling, shaming, rebuking, saying all the kinds of things Amy loves to see in her studies, I'm sure, with peer socialization, where this Lucille, she's sort of the classroom cop, and she doesn't really speak much Finnish or other languages. And she says, and don't speak when someone else is. So they're saying, don't speak a language other than English, and then don't, interrupt or overlap. And so looking at these kinds of norms. So these are two kinds of socialization many people are now looking at, so more teacher-directed or expert-directed, and then peer-to-peer. And there's another kind that I'm interested in, which isn't so relevant in what I'm going to talk about today. It's more relevant in my learning Chinese work, and that is where this is the typical model where there's the expert and the novice, and there's a kind of bidirectionality here, but basically there's an orientation to the standard or dominant and authoritative norm, or maybe something close to it. The peer socialization, there's kind of the orthodoxies up here, and there may be some other ones that kind of countercultures or subversive things people might be orienting to, but here the socialization is more horizontal than vertical. And then what I'm kind of interested in now is more self-directed socialization, which sounds wrong because of the social part, but where people are seeking out information about cultures, about language systems, and it could be pop culture worlds and so on, very independently and sort of do-it-yourself socialization through videos and things where they're taking a much more agentive role in understanding what is required to be a member of that culture. And there is a little bit of a problem talking about socialization in this manner, because in English we normally say someone is socialized into something by someone else. And usually you can't say by myself, do it yourself, socialization. So I'm calling it more self-directed socialization, which gives the learner, the novice, a much more agentive role. So that's just a bit of an overview of the field of language socialization, at least from my standpoint. And one other thing is that people are looking at it in terms of very different kinds of time scales and trajectories. I think some of the work that Judith Green and her colleagues did here in the Santa Barbara Classroom Discourse Group for a long time was looking at kids in math classes or in bilingual classes or in early years, and then really looking at them, say, over the whole year, but then focusing in on the first few lessons. That's at the beginning of the year when kids have to figure out what are the rules of this classroom. When am I allowed to speak? When do I have to sit? And what are the rules for doing math in this classroom? So it might be looking at time 1, time 2, time 3 over the year. Or it might be, looking at grade 1, grade 2, grade 3. It might be a lifetime, which is very expensive if you're doing longitudinal research over a lifetime. Hard to get published. But it might be multi-generational. It might be you're looking at the first generation who went to a place followed by the next 2 generations. When did language shift occur? So you're looking cross-generationally. So the times may be generations and looking at issues around language then. So there are many different ways of looking at it. In general, language socialization research tries to get that longitudinal perspective because it's connected with development. It's connected with learning new things and internalizing new knowledge and behaviors and ideologies. How that's defined or actually operationalized differs a lot. All right, so here are some of the contexts for the work I've done over the last while. The first one is quite relevant to today because this was my dissertation research in Hungary, and I'm going back to some of those same sites now. So this was looking at Hungarian English bilingual immersion, it's the same thing, high schools, where English was newly introduced. And I was looking at what was going on in those English medium content classrooms in comparison with the Hungarian medium standard curriculum classrooms. And I was looking at history in particular. I'll tell you a little bit more about that later because that is relevant. Then I did work in Canadian high schools with large numbers of typically Asian background immigrants in them, and looking at a similar kind of content area, social studies, to see what were some of the issues around the integration of students into the classroom discourse into the life of the school as well, but looking at how they were participating in classroom discourse and what kinds of challenges they faced and why. And I was doing work in a vocational setting with people who were learning English and also learning nursing or healthcare together, and then talking to them after they went into workplaces and what were some of the issues they had to grapple with around language and culture and behavior in nursing homes, for instance. And in that case, in the nursing homes or the hospitals with elderly people, these students in the program had been learning English to a high enough level to understand medical terminology and so on. What they had to learn to do was to modify their language to the basics. So people who had limited communication competencies for various reasons, or even limited English themselves, could understand the communication. So that was a bit of a twist looking at academic English discourse socialization at the university, through to doctoral studies. I have a PhD student working right now looking at doctoral dissertation writers. Here in the States you call them dissertators. Is that right? They do it in Pennsylvania. They're dissertators. We don't use that term. And then the Chinese work, and now this that I'm looking at is changing ideologies and practices. So the reason for looking at so many different kinds of contexts is to consider what kinds of principles, what kinds of processes, what kinds of factors are relevant in one and not in another, or things that you hadn't considered, thinking of those women learning English, medical terminology, healthcare, and then you have to think about, oh, but then they have to learn to speak more slowly, to simplify their language, to read bodies as texts based on facial, that means I don't want to eat, or so having to learn other things. So I find that interesting myself. So the current study. I've been going to the Chinese sites I'll introduce for the last few years, several times a year, and staying usually for a few weeks at a time. And you'll see from the images, they're beautiful places to be. So it's great to have a chance to go there, and very interesting linguistically. And the visits to the Hungarian schools just started this past month, right? I was just there. But I've had someone working for me in Hungary, a doctoral student, and then I had been going back and forth over the years too and seeing how things were changing. Along the way, I've been looking at teaching materials. This is for English as a foreign language in both contexts, textbooks, curriculum, exams, homework, interviewing various kinds of people, looking at students' essays about themselves and their lives and the role of English and their other languages, observing classes, and then looking at the media accounts of what's the role of English in Chinese society, in Hungarian society, and so on. So here are some of the kinds of questions I'm pursuing, addressing. How are students being socialized into and through English and English instructional practices in these two different contexts? What changes have taken place, at least from my perspective of having seen them in earlier years, but also in terms of what people have written about, other scholars, and what people are telling me from their own experiences. What are the ideologies and practices of people involved in English language education within their multilingual ecologies? And what are some of the similarities or differences across these very different contexts? Let me tell you a little bit more about that. China and Hungary, why the two? Well, I'll tell you more about the why after I tell you about the where. In both contexts, I was looking at provincial schools in the southwest of the country. So actually, on the Chinese map, it looks more south than west, but this is called southwest. This is Yunnan province. In the Hungarian case, it also looks more south, but it's also southwest. And these regions become interesting because that's where the most minority language users live. And also, they're just very interesting border regions here with Laos, Vietnam, Burma, Myanmar, and Tibet as an autonomous region here. And then in this case, Croatia, Ukraine, Romania. But anyway, down here is mostly Croatia and Germany, Austria on the northwest. That becomes relevant in the Hungarian case. So why these two places? Well, interesting contrasting cases and a personal history I have there. Both of those places, as some of you know, those who have come from China and those who may have spent time in Eastern Europe, will know that from the 50s to the 80s in both countries, English was at best looked down upon, at worst illegal, and could get people into a lot of trouble. And Russian was the main foreign language, unless people were using German as a heritage language in Hungary. So both of them had this sort of Russian specter over them and were dominated by that in terms of second foreign language learning. And then in the 2000s, all of a sudden, things opened up in both cases. Actually, Hungary, it was earlier, But really in the 2000s, you have these strongly emerging reform-oriented market economies with China joining the World Trade Organization, Hungary accessing to the, if you can use that verb, Hungary's accession to the EU, and then the globalization, IT, other kinds of mobility. So these countries that had been quite closed off and where English was not allowed, really, suddenly opened up, and English was the new great subject that people could now finally study, and that had some meaning to them because it would give them access to opportunities, social mobility, and so on. Both countries have a very competitive, streamed education system, more vocational, academic, and it's very hard to get in to the higher levels of education, and there's a lot of prestige associated with science and technology in both. And both populations are relatively homogeneous. 90+% of the populations would be ethnic Han in the Chinese case and ethnic Hungarian in the other. But they do have these minority groups I referred to. So I thought it would be really interesting to see what's going on with English in these two very disparate regions, but that have some shared history. So in the earlier work I did, which was in the late 80s, just as Hungary was opening up and the Soviet Union was dissolving, that's when, through various kinds of political reform and democratization, curricular innovations were introduced, like Hungarian English bilingual schools, Hungarian Italian, Hungarian French, Hungarian Spanish. The Hungarian Russian ones didn't get many takers. So all of a sudden, kids didn't have to study Russian anymore, and there was a lot of interest in English, and it was connected with turning to the West and internationalizing. In the classrooms themselves, which I looked at, there was a lot of contestation of traditional classroom routines and discourse patterns. For example, in Eastern Europe, Central Europe, recitation is a very, very common way of showing one's knowledge of a topic. And in fact, most of the assessment that's done for courses, for university entrance, is all done orally in this kind of recitation mode. But with the opening up, there was all of a sudden, even with Hungarian nationals teaching the courses, there was this kind of, they called it democratization of discourse. They didn't want things to be so authoritarian anymore. They wanted people to speak in class and learn in different ways. And it was also connected with the new identities people were seeking or claiming, mostly happily, claiming as people, as part of this new world order or whatever, the new Hungary. And people who could speak English, that had some cachet associated with it. So that was the context there. And there are similar kinds of things going on in the Chinese context. It's a little bit more complicated, but still an openness. And then as I did work from the late 80s into the early 2000s, I could see the shift from some of those students who had participated in my earlier work. They used to call themselves Eastern Europeans, but now they were Central Europeans, or just Europeans, or as one called himself, a European compatible, like what, IBM compatible or something, or ELF users, English as a lingua franca. We are people who use this language to be part of the greater Europe, even though they're not part of the Eurozone. Fortunately, they think now. It was a chance for them to travel, be part of Europe, to remain in identity Hungarians, but then be able to seek out opportunities. So even in the 2000s, that shift was going on. And then I thought, so now what are things like? Now English is taught from primary school in much of Hungary and China. So those special programs I talked about, they were public school programs with the immersion option, but they were at the secondary level, high school level, and at that time English was only introduced in middle school or high school, and now, as with many other parts of the world, it's introduced much earlier. So let me talk a little bit now about some of the similarities and differences I'm seeing across those two countries and the regions I'm looking at in the southwest of each. So in southwest China, the province of Yunnan, that has all those countries nearby, the border zone, there are 25 ethnic minorities in addition to Han majority population. So those minorities include Thai, which they call Dai, Nashi, Tibetan, there's a whole list of them. And there's a group of students in some of the schools where we've been doing research who have a particular status. Typically, they're minority plus from very disadvantaged rural, mountainous, farmer backgrounds. And they're in these schools together with the others in the schools. On the Hungarian side, in the region where I've been working, there are two major ethnic minorities. German, long-time German speakers, Schwabisch, which they call them Swabian too, who were part of the greater Austro-Hungarian Empire once upon a time, and they settled there. During the war, many of them were killed and so on, but there's still lots of German speakers in that region. And the Roma are what used to be known as gypsies. These are groups of people thought to have originated from northern India. Lots live in the Balkan area, but they move around. And there are different kinds of Roma. There are those who are settled. They're called sedentary Roma. And then there are the ones who still live a rather nomadic life. Well, in this area, there are a lot of settled Roma. And they have two different languages. There are two kind of streams. The languages are not mutually understandable. Many of the Roma in that area are losing their first language, whichever it is, depending on their roots, and are shifting over. But this is a very interesting area. But most of the people in general in those provinces are either Chinese Han or Hungarian. Now they're teachers trained to teach English, unlike in the early days in Hungary where who would teach English? Well, we'll just teach the Russian teachers to teach English. So there was this, English for Russian teachers program. And many of them went kicking and screaming into those English 3-year programs to be retrained. And now actually they're very happy that they got to be English teachers because the Russian classes are undersubscribed. If you just look in classrooms in both cases, you'll be surprised. Well, these people over here won't be surprised to know that there might be 60 or 70. In one of our classes, there were 78 students in the high school class. In the Hungarian classes, especially language classes, there would be maybe 12 to 18 students. Big difference there. High-stake exams in both places for high school matriculation, university entrance. In both places, the cachet of English pop culture, which fuels an interest in English, helps sustain it in ways that it doesn't work for Russian or even, sadly, German. Sorry, Dorothy, but German's really losing ground to English right now in this country where German was much more widely spoken and taught and learned up till the early 90s. Perception of a booming economy in China, perception of a slumping economy in the EU region, although both of them have tourist sectors because of their location and history. Both are very old, settled parts of China with long and colorful and very dignified history, very interesting history. And then there are other kinds of regional languages across the borders, such as Thai, Lao, Vietnamese, Japanese. Well, that's the way across the border the opposite way, but that are languages students could conceivably choose, but more of them choose English. In this case, I already mentioned about the shift to Hungarian for many of the Roma and German speakers. And then there's something that's in China, there's, of course, this big campaign around internationalization, the rise of China. You hear that everywhere, the rise of China. It's also part of a nationalism of pride in China after all the kinds of things China had gone through. In the Hungarian case, unfortunately, there's a kind of neo-nationalism taking place, and it's finding its way into the politics around English education, where just 2 weeks before I was there in October, there was a new decree that English was actually not necessarily good for the Hungarians' patriotism. And in fact, in those bilingual schools that have only gone from success to success since they started, they said, we can't teach history in English anymore. It's unpatriotic. Can't teach math either. I don't know why that's unpatriotic. But physics and chemistry, for which there are almost no teachers, that's going to be the thing. And so there's also other signs of this kind of nationalism and neo-nationalism, issues with the Roma and so on. So that's what the southwest region of China looks like. Beautiful. And these are kids in the schools. Of course, these are better resourced schools in small cities. Otherwise, the region is a developing region far from the capital. As I said earlier, it has a long history. It's part of the old Burma Road, but it is far from the sources of money for development. It's picking up, though. And then southwest Hungary, got pretty little towns, and this was a mosque. This was a church that became a mosque that became a cathedral because of the Ottoman Turkish settlement. So it's quite interesting. Now, I've been looking in this area of southwest China. I've been going to different towns and cities, and with the help of people in high places who can help get me into them, going into various kinds of schools and seeing what's taking place in the English classes. And you'll see some of the border regions here. And this region is also associated with distinctive architecture connected with one of the minority groups in particular. So when I went into these classes, starting in 2009, what really struck me was how much English language education was being tied to ideologies of, heroism and greatness and modernity and that sort of thing. And I don't know why I didn't expect to find it, but considering that the textbooks I'll tell you about shortly are produced by the Chinese government, People's Education Press, I was surprised what I saw. And then I started to ask myself, how are people being socialized through these media into particular identities, ideologies, and so on, in addition to the language and practices associated with English? So obviously, English provided students access to the language, but it also has these ideologies associated with it. And these we learned, my co-investigator and I, we learned were in fact joint objectives of the new English curriculum. So as one teacher said, we have two goals of teaching English. One is teaching the students language competence, language ability. That's what you would expect. The other is, as they say, you have to teach the students how to be a real person. In this process, you have to teach them how to cooperate with others and how to focus your own attention on others, on the world around you, to care for people and also the environment and so on. That is, I think that's very important because education is not just to teach the language or the knowledge. You have to teach a whole person. I thought it was really interesting that they would see that as the role of the English curriculum, not the role of the Chinese curriculum, which would have the classic poems, Confucius work, and so on. But this is one of the two main pillars of the English curriculum. As another teacher said, English teachers are playing a very important role because you are just shaping the students, socializing. You're helping to shape their values, to help them maybe develop their characters, shape their values. I think these will be important in later life. This person said, I think maybe 15 years ago, in the textbooks, we had a lot of things like plants, bamboo, and let me see, some stories like Napoleon, the writers, the publishers focus now more on character building. They want to put more elements of the moral things and culture. I thought that was very interesting, too, that English would be the vehicle for doing that, especially given English's history in China as connected with, evil empires and so on. So as we looked more closely at the situation and the media, the teaching materials and curriculum, we could see that language socialization was taking place through English in both countries, in both the educational contexts we were looking at, in the following ways. So the people were learning English and or academic discourse in the bilingual schools where they're doing math, history, and English, and then going on to some universities they can study in English, medicine, for example. But they're learning English and also particular discourse practices, whether it's around oral presentations, particular ways of reciting vocabulary, reading out loud, doing dialogues, or preparing for the much maligned high-stakes tests. Lots of meta-linguistic awareness raising. What kinds of identities? As global and even righteous citizens, as cosmopolitan, multilingual, interesting and informed individuals, speakers, innovators. I'll show you examples of this. Ideologies, as open-minded, progressive, democratic. I thought that was interesting in a Chinese government-produced textbook series. And then different kinds of affective stances that were being promoted. Enthusiasm, excitement, intensity, empathy, optimism. Okay, let's see. This is inside an elementary school English teacher's office where there's a big mural they painted on the wall saying, "The world will be more marvelous because of us." So this declaration to all who enter the English teacher's office, which has about 50 different teachers working in it, of kind of open optimism and expansiveness, inspiration, and the world is there. And it will be more marvelous because of us, the English teachers, and their students. And with their flags here, you know, all the places that will be affected. And then, so how does this show up in the actual textbooks? Well, the textbooks are a series. Yunnan, that southwest province, is about 5 years behind the rest of China in implementing the new English curriculum and textbooks and so on. So they're on the previous wave. But attached to the curriculum, there are a lot of publishing houses that make money from selling sort of newspapers that go along with the curriculum that give students extra practice with English. And then there's some Chinese. But it's also a channel of socialization. For example, this one says, "How to be a winner." This is the winner of an English-speaking competition. And China Daily, which is a national English language newspaper, publishes these things and sponsors those kinds of competitions. But this was the winner. And she was saying, it's a girl, even though she has a tie. She's saying, you know, you have to set goals for life, read daily in English, and think often. And the message is kind of how to be a winner is learn English and do speech contests. You'll be a winner. You, too, can be a winner by reading daily in English and thinking often. So this is kids during recess in a school that has several thousand students. And this is just some of the students doing their exercises. But the idea of English is it's a value added. It provides unique opportunities. It allows individuals who become very proficient to stand out from the masses, which is so key in a huge country like China, to have a voice, to have a brighter future, to have fun. So you'll see that affect term come up again. So these are some of the People's Education Press elementary school textbooks. And this is the kind of world that is constructed for these kids. It's a multi-racial, multi-ethnic, and also with little animals running around the world, and where people are having fun. They're part of this international community having fun, where there's Bin Bin and Joy and Bill and Lily and Lucky, and then the sections of the book are let's chant, let's do, let's act, let's. Very constructivist, all right? And then all these red-headed people in their world. It's good to see if you have red hair, right? Right? Where is Jenny's over there? Yeah. But then also very multi-ethnic. So, and then you have all these kids. So we wanted to, I should say this, make it pretty clear. We asked to go to schools where things were going well rather than going terribly wrong. Because there are all kinds of examples of places where the resources are poor, the teachers are not well trained, they have the best intentions, and we thought it really, what we wanted to see was examples of what could be done, and people who were proud to show what they were doing. So obviously it's not representative, but it shows what could be done, especially when you have 77 little children in your class doing recitations and things. Here's an example of that with one gifted teacher. And so this is on the theme of affect and having fun in English class. 67 students. Okay, and it goes on. And then someone mentions, and his girlfriend is so-and-so. He's, 8. And then he's just so scandalized by it, and people are falling off their chairs and everything. so much for decorum. But so you have these large, crowded classes, elementary, secondary school, where some teachers are trying to implement this curriculum, which is the mandated curriculum. And then with these high-stakes tests looming large in the distance, but and all the textbooks piled up in front of on their desks, the day's textbooks, and where they tried to do some of the things that we would associate with more communicative approaches to language teaching, and then let's look at the secondary curriculum, where they're learning content through language. So it's not just about language. They're learning about hybrid rice, about Special Olympics, about New Zealand. They're learning different kinds of ideologies, women's achievements and struggles, social inclusion, diversity, fighting discrimination, learning about world Englishes. And what I found interesting with this series is they're not just learning about Australia, Britain, New Zealand, Canada. They're learning about a lot of different countries as well, where they can use English to learn about countries, even if those countries are not English-dominant countries. And then tapping into students' interests of pop culture and technologies and so on. So then the students are being socialized into this kind of heroism and greatness I referred to earlier. Oprah Winfrey has inspired millions. Her rise to fame is an inspiring story. This is in the textbook. And in the class where they were doing this, they were also filling in a closed song exercise by Mariah Carey lyrics. The hero song. Here's the hero if you look into your heart. Da, 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 da. So hero. And then the scientist who's actually a Hunanese scientist who came up with this high-yielding hybrid rice. And then freedom fighters. Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela. This in a country where you're not allowed to protest, really, and you're not really allowed to, follow the lead exactly in doing some of the things the people in the textbooks did. So I thought that's very interesting. Then we have not only non-Chinese heroes or role models, but also Chinese. This Song Qingling, Pro Buck here. Then there's a talk, what do they call, cross-talk comedian here, and then Mr. Bean, Tootsie, Dustin Hoffman as Tootsie. And then Laurel and Hardy. So so English is fun. It's not only you can be a hero, but you'll have fun doing it. So that goes right through the materials, and then those are the main curriculum that the students experience. So what was going on in the Hungarian counterparts to these materials? Well, this is used in the elementary schools. The series is called Project. I think it's Oxford University Press, where they're talking about their homes and lives, also very multi-ethnic, very Britain-oriented, very London sort of oriented, with both the soundtracks are very British and the places they're talking about, the vernacular and so on. But where they're doing things with English, they're doing projects, and they have now a section, English across the curriculum, even in the elementary school textbook for EFL in this region. This textbook series seems to be international, but this is a Central European edition of it. And then at the secondary school level, high school, it's get happy. Just get happy with new headway. And it's a wonderful world, get happy, telling tales, doing the right thing. Just love it. I just love it. So, you know, it's about being happy. So if you compare these materials with what was used in the early 70s, or no, the late 70s, this is what the kinds of ideologies that were being socialized then. This was the textbook, 1978, that everyone used. They were very good at teaching superlative. So China is a great socialist country. The Chinese people are brave and hardworking people. We have friends all over the world, and so on. So strongest, longest, highest. It's sort of like the Olympic slogan, you know, whatever that is. So it's the longest wall in the world, the Great Wall, the highest mountain, the longest river. It actually is, they say, no, it's not the longest river in the world, it's the longest river in China, or in Asia, I think that's it. But it's sort of this China, pride in China and its traditions and its political ideologies and its great monuments and geography. Intonation practice. Is your father a worker? Yes, he is. Is your mother a worker? No, she isn't. She's a school teacher. Are they party members? My mother's a party member. My father isn't. Love. We love science. We make model planes, etc., etc. We study for the people. We love the people. We love the Communist Party. So these were the standard textbooks. And I think you're all too young. But I'm sure your parents, I mean, they could memorize these. They had to recite them, right? They could, and these were used till the early 90s, I think. And this is a text also from the same series, and looking at modality, must, learning the term must. So in the new headway in Hungary, the modality was, you know, we must have fun, that kind of thing. This is, you must work hard, you must learn to write good English, must learn from the scientists of other countries. Good health is a must for builders of socialism, not just for you, but for the greater cause. Above everything else, study Marxism. It's an important guide to the study of science. So the use, you know, combining the language side with a particular ideology of what makes a good citizen, what makes a good patriot, and a good socialist. And this was on the Hungarian side, the EFL textbooks from the 60s to 90s. According to my PhD student, she's my RA, but she's someone else's PhD student, but she's been helping me. She said that to import British English textbooks was illegal then, but there was some contraband. But this was the typical Hungarian textbook from the 60s to the 90s. So I chose one that's also with modality. So it's things like, it's lots of Hungarian, you can't read it. And then it's, have you to go to the factory today? I have not to go there today. And so it's about must and have to and so on. She must change, and then this is about taking the bus. She must change, and I have to stay at the factory and so on. So, and then the same person who's in Hungary gathering these things, she said there's, even in the later textbook series, there was one about discussions about the union in the factory, the trade union, and it was a very, very animated discussion about trade union at the factory. So that continued until we got happy and fun and all those new, with lots of images. And of course, part of it's economic. It's very expensive to produce this glossy, expensive materials. But then it's the content too, right? All right. So one of the schools that has been of particular interest to us in that southwest region attracts, it's kind of like a magnet school for minorities. It is a minority school, and the teachers are minority background teachers for the most part, but it attracts students from all over, and it's got a name that includes minority. And then at each grade level, there's a particular scholarship class that brings people in from these very disadvantaged areas. And so we were thinking, Duan Duan Li and I, wonder what English means to them coming from their backgrounds and where they see themselves going in the future, and how English or their other languages factor into that. And same for the teachers. How did they get to where they were? So we collected teachers' narratives about their lives and the role of English in them. I'll just tell you about 3 as an example. We have others who are Tibetan, and anyway, these were 3. In the case of, in all 3's case, they had come from themselves from very modest rural minority villages where they were the first in their families to become literate, and the first to go beyond primary school, the first to learn English, and then to become multilingual. And they were very proud of it, and it had really enabled them to do so much that their parents had been unable to do. So the first teacher I'm going to introduce, and I'm going to actually skip the second one. He's Bai nationality, and he knew, so Bai is, they call nationalities kind of minority, and it's a language and also an ethnicity. So, and he also learned a Nashi language, which has a different writing system completely, pictographic, because that was the language used at the marketplace. And he learned Mandarin only in high school when he got to the next bigger town or city, and then English in, I think, second year of high school. And all of the 3 that I have in a longer paper were originally inspired to pursue English by one Chinese English teacher in high school, and then they had gone on to gain other experiences. And they were all, these 3 were very involved in supporting this special track of students at their schools who came from these disadvantaged backgrounds. Those are called the Hongzhi class students. Hongzhi is translated in different ways, but the one we take is called Great Expectations. And so they get a scholarship stipend, and they stay in the school, in residence, and typically go back just once a year. And so this teacher was talking about his ideas of his role to socialize them and the other students, and how he himself had become open-minded through learning English, but that you need to be stronger than the others in this very competitive world. Let me just read one teacher C, I call him, his account. He says, so he's Bai nationality, also a computer and media specialist, somewhat surprising given his origins in a remote mountainous area near the Burmese border, so Myanmar. He finished his primary school in the small local village school with 25 students in total, and he's the media guy now in this town school. And they were all the 25 students were in the same class. Like other teachers, he knew only Bai language throughout primary school because the whole village was Bai. For junior middle school, he went 40 kilometers from his hometown, 8 hours on foot up and down narrow and treacherous trails each way. He and a few others from the village, including his twin brother, walked to school together on Sundays, carrying on their backs the food they would cook and eat during the week, collecting firewood and grinding their own corn for flour, returning on Saturdays to repeat the trek again the following day. He began to learn English in the second year of senior high school in the county's top school, 400 kilometers from home, or 3 days travel, 1 day walking, and then buses. His first teacher, English teacher, Chinese, from a village next to his own, provided him a great deal of help. He, this teacher, in turn became his unofficial teaching assistant while still a student himself. So being socialized into English teaching as the unofficial TA, correcting students' English assignments when he was just in the second year of learning English himself. He became very interested in English, and then he would go on to study to start to be a teacher at 19, to go on to the university, and even to the day when we interviewed him, we've talked to him many different times, but he still listens to the BBC and Voice of America radio broadcasts via internet every day, went to the UK in 2007 for a few months as a special kind of class, and he's in charge of this Great Expectations scholarship class. English had been crucial for him in getting a job. In fact, after people saw his success, people from his village, they said they wanted to go into the outside world like him, meaning this town. He concluded, if you know a little English, you can learn more about the outside world. Especially now, you can use the website. There are many foreign friends in China and beyond. You can communicate with foreigners and so on. So all three of the teachers, I've only just glossed over, came from these very modest backgrounds, but had embraced English thanks to an inspiring teacher, and then had taken part in some teacher development subsequently, and now were in the role of trying to socialize their own students into English and through English into these other ideologies. I'm going to skip over this, but we also have about 150 or more essays written by the Hongzhi students in those programs, different years, about themselves, their languages, when they started learning English, what it means to them, and so on. And also the process of becoming a Hongzhi class student, the kinds of adaptation and acculturation, socialization, they experienced moving from their little towns into, or villages, into this city to study and live among the others. And it's been a very traumatic, lonely process for many, so they have to do a lot to keep the students feeling safe and supported and so on. So it's a nice place to study English, this one student wrote. As we all know, learn a new language well needs an environment where people speak the language. This school, we have no English speakers. We always spoke to each other in English. It helped a lot. Our teacher always encouraged us. It gave me powerful confidence to learning English well. And then it's the idea of it will help us to step into society, necessary, important for us. So they see it. The sad side, and I can't really talk about it in this presentation, is what I'm seeing with these kids and former teachers, or teachers coming from all these regions into these sort of magnet schools. They're losing their first languages as a result. They're losing Bai. Their parents spoke Bai. They don't speak Bai anymore. They're starting to lose it, or Nashi, or Thai. So that they're gaining Mandarin, which is a crucial lingua franca around China and the wider Chinese-speaking world. They're learning English, which gives them social mobility and access, crucial opportunities to study, travel. But the cost is their own cultures and languages, and many of them are really old, ancient, amazing cultures. So there's this sort of negotiation between the local, the regional, or national, and then the global. So in their towns, they see, in the essays they did for us, they also put in pictures and things they snapped with little phones or whatever. This is a Hungarian one, but these are Chinese, the local, the provincial, and so on. And the teachers are trying to foster pride in those, understandably. But then they're seeing London or Beijing or Sydney. And when we asked them about culture and music, even up by the Tibetan border, people said, "Oh, do you know folk songs?" And then we said, blah, blah, blah. And we said, "What about you? Can you sing a song?" And then they were doing break dancing and Jay-Z, hip-hop. And they said, "Can you do Lady Gaga?" And all these kids who had come from really tiny little villages. And they said, "What about Steve Nash? He's a Canadian basketball star in the States, you probably." Anyway, so the role of pop culture as pulling them in both the Hungarian and Chinese cases. I'm going to skip over that. I think we did that. Next steps in this research. We still have the Hungarian teacher interviews, 20 plus to transcribe, and other teacher interviews that we've done. We have recorded classroom discourse. We still need to look at how the ideologies and things map onto the actual linguistic or interactional practices. We'll do some of that. The Hongzhi narratives, different ways we might look at those. And then future visits. One of my MA students is doing a systematic analysis of the textbooks in terms of the ideologies at 3 different ones. I showed you some from the first, and then there's a second, and there's a third at the middle school level. So I didn't show you, I showed you elementary and high school. She's looking at middle school. And then there's a PhD student who's a professor who's connected with this, and he's doing research in the borderland regions as well. So some issues might arise from your perspective and others who do language socialization with respect to this. That is, well, how can you do language socialization research with limited classroom interactional data? Because typically the language socialization work by Eleanor Oakes and others has looked not necessarily in classrooms, but in face-to-face interactions between individuals, peers, or expert novice, or however it's construed. But I think I would like to make the point that that's what I've done before too. But I think we need to look at some of these other circulating kinds of cultural capital and linguistic capital, semiotic capital, whatever, or ideologies as well, and see what they're getting in the textbooks, what they're exposed to, what they're taking, what they're not taking from that. People might also say, well, language socialization research normally involves prolonged engagements in classrooms, you know, a year on site, ethnographic in that way. Well, with my full-time job in Vancouver, it's very hard to be not only in one site, but 2 sites. And so we've never cast it as an ethnography, far from it. We only have said that this is qualitative with a kind of ethnographic perspective on what's going on. But we just don't have the means of doing anything more fully where we're in the classroom day. And actually, they don't want it. They don't want people hanging around. And in one of the schools we went to 2 weeks ago was in Hungary, was a Roma-only school. It's a very special school funded by the EU, and it's one of the only ones in Europe where only Roma study together. And for many of them, the teachers said, you know, it's not easy because many of them have never used a sit-down toilet before. When they come to the school, they've lived often as travelers, moving from place to place. So there's a lot of socialization, but it's also a very sensitive and highly politicized context, the Roma in Europe. So, you know, there's no way we would be able to sit in there for a long period of time. But there are some other researchers whose work we have consulted in that school and getting a sense of. And then people will say, what about the status of language socialization research based largely on public ideologies? That's what the policies, resources, what we can see around us in the linguistic landscape. Well, that's one approach, and there are others, and I see them as complementary. So to sum up then, English socialization expands repertoires and possibilities, possibly notions of global citizenship or imagined futures for these students and the teachers when they themselves were students. It involves language shift in the Chinese rural regions, unfortunately, but they do see it as, you know, a source of inspiration, fun, and so on. And in the Hungarian case, there's the battle with German, the politics of English right now, the inevitability of English as the regional lingua franca, more so than German, though. And I'll end with that. Thank you very much. It's time for questions or comments or discussion. Yes?
Yeah, I have a cluster of questions about, I'll just ask a single thing.
Okay.
And the thing is, about contrast, and what one can attribute to socialization around the English language. So, for example, one can see, well, one part of this is you're dealing with socially with minority populations, which would have complex views also of the dominant language as well as English.
Yes, Mandarin, yes.
And so how does this compare then to members of the dominant culture and dominant language groups and their view? Similarly, one could see in materials from the 70s and 80s that it looks like those materials probably continuous also with the kind of approaches that were taken in other subject areas in the dominant language. To what now there was maybe to what extent now are the materials the same as being pursued in the dominant language, and to what extent are they different? So like please imagine that the cosmopolitan themes may be specially focus of English, but it may not be. It may be that the heroism themes are common across, or the fun themes might be common across. So
yeah, thanks. You're Charles, right?
Yes.
We asked people about that when they were saying, "Oh, English is all about fun and heroism." We said, and cosmopolitanism. And we said, "What do you do in your Chinese classes?" And they said things like, Tang Dynasty poems or the classics. That they don't go near this kind of material. I mean, it's very much traditional approach, and the materials are quite traditional. The teachers take it very seriously. It's serious study, and in fact now, especially in Hungary, they're saying those Hungarian teachers need to do a better job of, teaching Hungarian, because we don't want kids losing Hungarian because they're learning English. That's sort of that conservatism. So we did ask them. It may be the case that there are teachers who diverge from that kind of scenario and do other sorts of things. We have people here who have come through Chinese literature courses, but in that region, they really made the contrast between what they were doing in the English classes. Even the way of doing it in the Chinese language arts class, for example, in China, the kids wouldn't be doing group work and running up to the board and doing competitions and practicing dialogues, singing songs. Well, they would sing maybe certain kinds of songs that in the early years, but the curriculum is quite different, apparently. As for their views, the Han Chinese views of English versus the minority students' views, we didn't originally plan to look at only minority students, and in fact, there are some schools where most of the students are Han majority students. It's just in one region where we have a majority of minority students, if that makes sense. So we have both perspectives, and I think it is more complicated, though, with those who come from the language minority backgrounds. They don't see it as an issue in some cases that they're losing the language of their parents and grandparents, just as is common for people in Canada and the States, kids, to say, I don't want to learn Chinese, or I don't want to go to Japanese Saturday school, and then they sort of regret it later. Some may not. But so for some of those students, they don't have issues with that. But others wrote, especially in their essays, more so than in interview discussions, that they felt it wasn't right. It just wasn't right that they couldn't speak the language of their parents and grandparents anymore, that they didn't know how to write Tibetan. They could speak conversational Tibetan, but they didn't know how to write Tibetan. That chances were that in a generation that their families wouldn't speak any Tibetan, maybe even understand Tibetan. So there was that sense already of regret from many people saying, "Oh, it's a beautiful language, and I'm sorry, I won't." As for the Han Chinese students vis-a-vis English, there's an inevitability to it. English is the language of opportunity. Whether you like it or not, you have to do it for the college entrance examinations. I think the greatest regret is from people who are really good in science and are not good in languages, and to know that this will English will probably prevent them from getting a very good spot at university, and from their parents who feel this isn't right. This is a brilliant young budding physicist, and because of the English, this kid may get to a vocational school of some sort, but will never get to Tsinghua University because the English is so. Most of the narratives, most of the hype is English is this language of access, but for some students, especially in the sciences, it's a language. It provides is a source of barriers to them achieving or fulfilling their potential in certain areas. I see people nodding. Do you agree over there? Yeah. So, and that's regrettable. And my colleague in Yunnan, who's doing his PhD, he's already a dean, but he's doing his PhD because he feels very strongly that in that southwest region, more people should be encouraged to do Lao, Vietnamese, Burmese, so they can do business and other kinds of exchange, whatever it might be, with those neighboring countries, and that English might be useful, but it shouldn't come at the expense of those regional neighbor languages. He doesn't get into the issue of the heritage languages because it's sensitive, especially Tibetan. It really is very sensitive. So if you go anywhere near Tibetan schools, there's a lot of security and so on. So people don't want to talk about that too much, but about the minority languages, but about other international languages, yes, they feel that it might be nice if students could do languages of their neighbor countries and families in some cases. Thai. Other questions? Yes.
Thank you for a very, very fascinating presentation. I feel like I'm somewhat persuaded by this. Let's get happy. I should be happy because I speak in English. I was just wondering, so with these students that have been in such a situation throughout their whole lives, this kind of socialization, English is opportunity, English is being happy, how successful are they in terms of their English proficiency? I mean, their writing was very good.
That was one of the better ones.
Oh, okay.
No, it depends a lot on the individual. Some were really good. The curriculum is such that they don't have many opportunities to produce extended oral or written discourse. They're not rewarded for it. They're not. The testing it's the science of these very esoteric kinds of collocations or constructions, and there's a whole science to it. And they have in one of the schools, they spend every evening and weekend studying practice tests to get a sense of what items might be on the high-stakes test. So that's not much fun, and there's not a lot of happiness there for teachers or for students. But in the end, many of them get, from that minority school, they have quite a high rate of success with getting placements at universities or colleges. I must say, though, it's on the backs of many of those teachers. Teacher B, I didn't read or give you a profile of him, but he has been the form teacher for the grade 12 class for the last 5 years and had no holidays for 5 years. Tremendous pressure, especially with these Great Expectations classes, because that whatever happens to that child, not necessarily the only child in the family, because they're from minority backgrounds, they might have more than one child by policy, but the parents, the village's hopes are pinned on the success of that child getting into a good university or college of some kind. So the pressure on the teachers is really unbelievable. And in those residential schools where the students live and study in the school, the teachers have to stay with them in the evening till 10:30 every night in their study room. And sometimes I was invited to come, you go and you say, oh, we'd just like to observe some classes, sure. And then they say, can you inspire our students? So then they ask you to talk to 100 students, to cheer up 100 students, because on the wall, you guys will know, on the wall it has how many days till the exams, 100, 99, 98, 99. And the years I was doing this, all our colleagues had grade 12 kids also going through it. They were all nervous wrecks. And so we were asked to inspire 100 students, but because the teachers have to be with them till 10:30, till they go to bed. And from 6:30 in the morning, when they do their oral reading, they walk around reading out loud in English in the class, actually from 7:20, but they have to get there even earlier. So it is brutal. I mean, they do well, but it's tremendously costly. It's at the end of grade 12. But every month in the English class, every month they have a test that's done within the school. And if people aren't doing well, word gets out to them and their parents and back to the village. They'll get the parents in from the border to say your child is not doing very well. They go to these little border towns. It's not much fun, not much fun. It's pressure. So it is a kind of the reality, and then the message is in really sharp relief. Yeah. Other questions, comments, people? How about you, visitors? Mm-hmm.
I think that thank you,
Duff. Mm-hmm.
I think that what you talk about the curriculum in terms of expectations and in terms of the class motivations and also the test materials is quite right. So the teachers that we try to train, I'm from a teachers college, teacher education university, and we did a lot of teacher training. And they said that they have to struggle a lot because on the one hand the curriculum
Yeah.
to achieve the 5 goals, affective and affect and culture and then knowledge development, skill development and cognitive development as well. But on the other hand, there is always this high stakes entrance examination. So it's on the other hand, they have fun classes and they try to apply this audiolingual or this communicative approach. But on the other hand, so they always have to work out means to deal with those examinations, which is like high stakes. So that's why I think I try to agree with you. There's always a conflict.
There's a lot of conflict. And also the teachers' class results are compared with other teachers all the way, every month. You're held to account. So it's really tough. And also I found this couldn't happen in Canada, what I'm going to say next. And that is, well, none of it. But what I'm going to say next is that there's so much competition to become a master teacher. So there are teacher contests, and there's the best English teacher competition, like a sing-off, like a poetry slam. It's an English teaching slam. And they have these things, and then you get to be the master teacher of the school and of this county and of the province. And some of the people in our thing are master teachers, top 100 teachers of the province. Ooh, that's big. And, but there's this whole culture of meritocracy and of becoming a really kind of celebrated, a very successful English teacher. And so I participated in sessions just as an observer where people would do their demo teaching, not a competition. There'd be every month a demo teacher, and then they would be critiqued, given feedback. Oh, you could do this. Did you think about doing that? The teachers who I saw were actually really good. That people had, you should try this. And so there's a lot of attention paid to teacher development. And if teachers don't measure up because of the high stakes, they will be directed somewhere else. Or maybe in the case of women, if they go on parental leave, maternity leave, they might not be hired back because the stakes are so high. I don't know what happens to the men, because the men we worked with are already those master types. They survived. Yes?
Do you remember the TESOL Quarterly article about 7 or 8 years ago, the long narrative by the Chinese, I think it was a PhD student, when the narrative was, he told it to somebody, I think it was written by somebody else about 8 years ago, and he was an English teacher, and he told the history of his own experience coming from a small village, and when they were first imposing CLCs,
Oh.
all the students hated it, and partly because they were all prepping for the exams, and he later became himself an English teacher, and he talks about this one experience where he was supposed but he didn't want to do it, so he went back to the traditional one, and an observer came into class, one of the government people. Do you remember that?
No, I don't know, but there was an early article by Burnaby and Son.
Great.
Oh, I need to find that. There was early stuff by Burnaby and Son when it was just the communicative language teaching was first being introduced or implemented, and about the resistance.
When it started, and he was a student.
Well,
An unwilling student. I mean, I've used it for my TESOL classes because it really kind of shows the other side of
yes.
CLT.
Yeah, if you can find it, Jen, that'd be great. If you could send me the reference. Sway? Oh, it was Amy Sway? Oh, okay. Yeah, and back to Charles, your point about what goes on in the other subjects. I know what goes on in Hungarian history classes because I observed those in Hungarian. And, lots of recitation, not to say that that's a bad thing, but various ways of getting students to talk about the Russian Revolution. Actually, when I was doing my original observations in '89, Hungarian history stopped in 1945. That was the end. No one wanted to touch 45 to 89 or 90. There was no, it wasn't taught, it wasn't tested, there were no textbooks, but the Russian Revolution was a popular topic. So the materials, they started to get in British published materials and providing different perspectives, but at that time, all the materials for subjects, physics and so on, were monochromatic, sheet paper and so on. I don't know that the teaching of physics has changed much since then. As one example, I met with a head teacher of physics, and I've known the couple for years and years. And Hungary is well known for high-level theoretical physics. And they're really, but what he did say, and his son was there, his son's a physics student at university, and he said what they're lacking in the curriculum is any hands-on. They don't have labs. They're very good in the theoretical, but not very good in the applied. And the universities don't have the resources, so they need to go to Munich or somewhere else if they want to really study in a lab. They don't have the lab, but the theoretical is very strong. So I think it's still, and I asked people, were they still doing kind of the recitation, it seemed like.
I guess just English really is the entryway to a different world, the modern with the cosmopolitan world, which they're not getting anywhere else. It really is.
That's my sense, and I stand to be corrected, but that's what people were telling me. And it wasn't happening in Russian classes, or even the German textbooks are more contemporary with, very similar, high level, but German doesn't have the same kind of pop culture association, so it's harder to make German cool in the way that the kids find English cool. With all due respect to Dorothy and her life's work.
I'm moving away from German. Well, I know some people have to go, so let's officially thank Professor Duff.
Very welcome. Thank you.
You're welcome to stay if you have other questions, but otherwise if you need to go.
Go see what's happening with the election.
Thank you all very much for coming.
Thank you for coming.
Really,
Nice
but
to
your
see you. Good
talk
luck
was
with your marking.
great. That was a wonderful.
Good luck with your marking of 2 sets.